Hello, my name is Ji-Hyun Park, and today we'll be looking at some AP US history questions from the Cold War. So question number 2 is a typical MCQ plus source type of question, and you'll usually have around 1 minute and 10 seconds to solve these type of questions. So the question is, how would you analyze the source itself, understand what the source is talking about, and then choose a correct line of answer. And I think a thing a lot of students miss, and the thing that helps me solve A-push questions fast, is to read the question itself. So there is usually 1 or 2 hints within the question itself. The question reads, what's the main foreign policy strategy that Truman's promoting here? So we know that this is a speech by then President Harry S. Truman, 1947, and before a joint session of Congress. 2 things to note about the year 1947. This was before the term called the Iron Curtain or the Cold War began. So it was a time of less hostility between the United States and the USSR. If you just think of the Cold War itself, I'm sure you know the entire situation. The United States, USSR, China, Korea would be over around here, and then Europe, South America, divided by ideological lines of this part being communist, this part being capitalist. Some things to note. So we know that it's 1947, and we know that it is a joint session of Congress by a US president. We know that there's a foreign policy strategy coming out of it. And that's when you start reading the quote itself. One way of life is based on the will of the majority. It's talking about democracy itself. It is distinguished by free institutions, representative government, free election, all the good stuff. You don't have to read too much into this. Just note that the first paragraph is talking about democracy. The second part, according to at least President Truman, will of a minority, so less democratic, forcibly imposed on the majority. Terror, oppression, control of the press, framed election, etc., etc. This is talking about an autocracy. We'll call it communism for now. So he's comparing democracy and communism, and his conclusion is that I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities by outside pressures. So he's comparing the United States democracy to USSR communism and stating that he wants to help people not overthrow governments, but to resist the attempted subjugation by armed minorities. So he wants to spread democracy across the world is the main point of this joint address. So once you have a brief gist, even if you don't understand guarantees of individual liberty or framed elections, you know that there is a contradiction going on. And I think those are the biggest hints you take into the options themselves. So option number 1 is refusing peacetime alliances. Again, this is about the difference between democracy and communism and how President Truman wants to promote democracy. So peacetime alliances, probably NATO, not the thing we're talking about. Acquisition of territory, again, while the source itself talks about supporting free people and resisting attempted subjugation, it does not talk about acquisition of territory by force or by any other means. So option B is not the answer. C is the containment of communism. As we saw from the map, because the United States wanted to contain communist countries from ever reaching out to the outside world, the containment of communism does make a little bit of sense, but please don't read too much into it, just put a triangle. The fourth option is nuclear proliferation. It talks about 1949 when the United States had their Oppenheimer moment. Afterwards, the Russians also got their own nuclear weapons. However, this has nothing to do with democracy, tyranny, and how the United States supports democracy across the world. So if you go back to your option choices, your only option would be number C. Now, there are a couple of ways to solve this question. You can date them. So for example, nuclear proliferation 1949, acquisition of territory not after 1947, so around 1892. So that would not be an answer choice. Refusing peacetime alliances, NATO 1949. So that does make sense. So you can either take out B because the years doesn't make any sense, or you can just read the options themselves and then choose the correct answer. My tip for solving at least question number 2 is to not read too much into the source itself. Just know what the paragraphs themselves are talking about. So that's question number 2. Great, let's move on to the next question. So this is question number 3 from APUSH Cold War, 1949 to 1980. Again, let's read the question. Which of the following was the most immediate result of the approach advocated by Keenan in his telegram? George Keenan was a worker in the US State Department, which is the Foreign Services Department in the United States. The only thing we know about George Keenan, the only part that comes in the syllabus, is George Keenan's long telegram. Which was drafted in 1946. And that's all we need to know. We know, at least from the book, that George Keenan wrote a memo to his superiors stating that the USSR wanted a worldwide revolution. I mean, we can go into lengths about the telegram itself. However, this was the beginning of what the United States will call a policy of containment. Going back to the map that we drew, the USSR was turned into a communist state in 1917. However, China in 1949 had spread into a communist state. Afterwards, you had Vietnam in South Asia. You had countries like Indonesia trying to become communist states. So from the perspective of the United States, they could see what we now call the domino theory, how one country becomes communist and spreads communism to other parts of the world. So this is the domino theory, and the containment are two things that you need to remember when looking at this question. So that's the background for the George Keenan's long telegram, of course in your book, so you know everything about it. How much should you read into the quote itself? Because ultimately, even if you look at the quote, there won't be a big difference in what George Keenan is saying. Containment, domino policy are the only two things that you should remember about George Keenan. So, you can read a little bit into it, but the whole point is, even if you don't understand some words or some vocabulary within, you shouldn't give it too much weight. 3 words that do stand out, at least from reading the source again and again. The first thing that you should remember is formulate a policy in a world where we have put forward in the past. So this means a change in policy. That's number 1. Number 2 is it is not enough to urge people to develop XYZ. They're talking about non-US citizens in Europe who are traumatized by the past. So there is a real threat to the worldview, which is the USSR, and we should do better than the Russians to do XYZ. So you should provide aid to other countries, especially for Europeans in this context. So we need a change in stance. There's a threat by the USSR, and we should solve it by giving aid to other countries. That's all you need to do. But if you're short on time, because it is a minute, please don't read too much into the source as long as it's from George Keenan. So the answer choices. A foreign policy shift towards minimizing the United States' role in NATO. It's the opposite of what we're talking about. You want to participate more to solve problems of Europe and to roll back communism. So A would not be an option. B, a domestic policy shift towards dismantling the military-industrial complex. Wrong president, wrong time. Nope. Number C, a foreign policy shift towards collective security and containment. Here again, we're talking about NATO. And this is a triangle. D, a domestic policy shift towards reducing taxes to support the global economy. We're not talking about the domestic environment at all. So it's a very easy choice, number C. However, sometimes students get confused with number A because it has NATO in it and the United States and a policy shift. So it has the 2 out of the 3. However, the direction is different. So please do not consider number A when you're doing it. I've brought 2 of the most, I think, simple questions, at least in AP US History. But the whole point of question number 2 and 3 was to give you a gist of how you should tackle and approach questions when you see them. 1, 2, maybe 3, and then number 4. Please remember, at the end of the day, this is all based on your information and knowledge, so you shouldn't give too much weight into the sources themselves. And those are questions number 2 and 3 of AP US History. Thank you.